Hi, students. Welcome to video 5. It is on ecosystem ecology. So here are our objectives for video 5. I'll let you pause the video and kind of read through them, but most of them are things that you should probably remember from biology at least a little bit. So levels of organization, you need to know and be able to put them in order and know what they are. Organism is the same as an individual. Population is a group of individuals or organisms. Community is multiple populations. Ecosystem now includes abiotic factors, so water, air, that sort of thing. And then a biome, we know we've talked about already, is a very, very large area that includes lots of different ecosystems. So the factors that impact populations, you have two: density dependent, density independent. Basically, density dependent depends on the number of individuals that you have. So things like food, water, disease, those all really depend on how dense an area is. So disease will flow through a very dense population a lot differently than a very scattered population. Density independent are things that it doesn't matter how many animals or plants there are. One zebra or 100 zebras, drought is going to impact those zebras in the same way. And then carrying capacity is limiting factors acting on a population. So we know carrying capacity is the number of individuals that our ecosystem can support. And those limiting factors like space and food are going to be impacting that carrying capacity. So when we talk about abiotic and biotic factors, be able to list out a few. Biotic factors are basically all of your consumers and producers. Abiotic factors are all of your non-living things in the environment. So things like the sun, precipitation, oxygen, those sorts of things. Now down here, when we have the soil can be both abiotic and biotic because there's bacteria in the soil that are breaking down different organisms. So again, that one has living and non-living in it. So some key words to know in terms of definitions are keystone species and indicator species. Keystone species have an unusual large impact on the ecosystem, like the American alligator, the elephant, and the wolf. Here is your keystone right here in the arc, and if you take that out, all of the other animals and organisms will basically collapse. Indicator species serve as early warning signs for an environment. Most of the time, they're going to be things like birds, reptiles, amphibians. You may have heard the canary in the coal mine, which alerts the coal miners to low oxygen levels if the bird dies. So that's an indicator species. So we're going to talk about food chains and food webs now. And producers are the base of all of our food chains and food webs, and they are producing all of our food. They do this by photosynthesis. Yes, you need to know and memorize this formula. If it helps, remember the number 666. Okay, not the greatest numbers in the world, but they will help you remember this formula. So you have 6 carbon dioxides, you have 6 oxygens. It's producing glucose and 6 waters in the beginning over here. It's producing glucose and 6 oxygens. And then the opposite of opposite of photosynthesis is respiration. Glucose and oxygen giving us carbon dioxide and water. So here's our food chain. We have our producers, also known as an autotroph, if you don't know that word. We have our consumers, also known as heterotrophs. You also need to be familiar with herbivore, which is something that eats only plants, like our grasshopper. You need to know carnivore, eat only animals, like the owl and snake. And omnivores eat both plants and animals, like the bird. So when we look at a more complex situation, we have a food web, which has multiple food chains in it. You'll notice that the producers are at the bottom of the food web and the consumers are at the top. We also talk about a positive feedback loop in our food webs, and this is a trophic cascade. So say, for example, I take out the grasshopper. Remember, positive feedback loop is changing in the same direction. So if I take out the grasshopper, the rat is also going to die off because it doesn't have a grasshopper to eat. Since the rat has died off, the bird will have issues because the wolf is now only going to be feeding on that. If the wolf is only feeding on the birds, then the dragonflies are going to have issues because now the bird is not going to be around, and now the dragonfly is going to be feeding on these animals. And then eventually the frog will go extinct, and you see the idea here, all of our organisms start to be impacted. So again, this is a positive feedback loop. Multiple organisms are dying off because even just a few are gone from our food web. So again, the base is our producers. That gives us 100% of energy in our food web. And on average, about 10% is passed along into each next level. So we lose a lot of the energy as heat, the actual cost of doing business in your body, digestion, all those sorts of things. And then here's actual numbers. And I would draw this pyramid, or at least, you don't have to draw the animals or anything, but just label the pyramid and put some numbers in there. So the producers might give us 20,000 kilocalories meter squared per year. Then I move up, I only get about 10%. So that's 2,000. And then I have 200, 20, and 2. So this is pretty easy calculations here. We're just taking off a 0. So what are some of the things that our ecosystems do for us? You should know these words: provisioning, supporting, cultural, and regulating. Provisioning, think like when you get a food provision. So how much food, water, wood, things like that we actually get. Supporting services are things that support the ecosystem. So nutrient cycling, soil, productivity, that sort of thing. Regulating are things that help regulate our ecosystem. So climate, water, air regulation, keeping the air and the water clean. Then we have things that are more human, and that's a cultural service. So, like spiritual, aesthetic, educational values for ecosystems. So, we're going to talk about bioaccumulation and biomagnification now. When you have toxins in your food chain, it can affect individuals and it can also affect the entire food chain. So, if it affects an individual and it accumulates inside the tissues of one organism, we call that bioaccumulation. Okay, if it then accumulates and goes up in the food chain, that is biomagnification. Okay, so this is an individual over here, bioaccumulation. Biomagnification is increasing toxicity in each level of the food chain. Okay, and to give you an idea and kind of analogy for this, I'm going to play a quick game of Pac-Man. And you can play this for free online. Okay, so Pac-Man is the yellow dot or the yellow little thing. That's me. The ghosts are chasing me, trying to kill me, and I'm eating these little organisms. Oh, I get a ghost. Oh gosh. Oh, okay. So you get the idea. That's playing Pac-Man. Okay, so I'm going to go back over here. So how does that relate to what we're talking about? Why in the world is Miss Jones playing Pac-Man? So imagine that the Pac-Man is the consumer, okay, and the consumer is eating food. These are the little food pellets. Okay, so he nom nom nom, he eats food. Okay, and some of that food had pollution in it. So the blue dots are representing pollution. Okay, now you have the ghost, which is going to eat Pac-Man, and that ghost gets all of the pollution. Now the ghost is going to eat another Pac-Man, and it gets more pollution. It's going to eat another one. It gets more pollution. You get the idea here. So that's biomagnification. Now you have a fish that's going to eat that ghost, and it gets all of that pollution inside of it. Okay, it can eat another ghost, and it gets even more pollution. Okay, so that is what biomagnification is, an increase in pollutants with the trophic level. So what things biomagnify? We're going to look at persistent organic pollutants and mercury. But these things are things that I am not excreting out. So when I ingest them, they're getting like absorbed into my tissues, and they're going to actually be biologically active. So they're not just going to be urinated out. So things like persistent organic pollutants, an example would be DDT. So it's present in pesticides, plastics, pretty much any industrial chemical. The problem with DDT, if you remember, Rachel Carson is the one who told us that DDT has some issues with our ecosystem. It interfered with a bird's ability to produce calcium. And calcium is really important to make the eggshells very hard. So the eggshells were really thin, and then when the birds set on the eggs to incubate them, they would break. And then, of course, the baby birds cannot hatch. Another issue with POPs is they are hormone disruptors. They mimic estrogen, and so you end up having more females born than males, which is not good for the overall population. Mercury is also something that biomagnifies. So we burn coal, and that releases mercury into the atmosphere, and then it can rain down and be deposited on land and water. And once it gets into bacteria, it turns into this organic form, methylmercury. And now that's what can get into our food chain. And the streams that were tested in the US, of the 300, every single one of them contained fish that had mercury poisoning in it. So this is one reason why you're not supposed to eat a ton of fish, because it can accumulate in your body. So, what are the impacts of this? Most of them are neurological: blindness and deafness, seizures, muscle tone issues, delayed motor development, and decreased brain size. Because they are neurological and children are developing in uterus for pregnant women and children are the most at risk for these effects. These are fish that you should eat versus ones you shouldn't. North Carolina is a state that has a fish advisory. So if you catch anything from our waters, you want to be careful. Things that you should eat: salmon is fine, not so bad. Canned tuna is starting to get up there. Shark and swordfish are things that you should not eat a lot of because they're going to have a very high mercury content. Okay, bring your questions tomorrow. Thank you.